Thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar. This is part of the PPMD webinar series on research and care. And today we're going to take a behind-the-scenes look at clinical trials in Duchenne. We've certainly heard a lot of results presented lately, and now we're going to look at the other side. How do you put these trials together? What goes into them? What are the challenges and the logistics? And you all are also going to have a chance to weigh in. Some of you who have dialed in may have presented or may have participated in a clinical trial. I think we'd be interested in your feedback and your perceptions of how that went, and certainly we'll be able to ask questions. So today with us we have special guests, our own Holly PA, who's Vice President of Education and Outreach, who is going to give you some of the results of a survey that we did earlier this year looking at people's experiences in participating in clinical trials. And she's going to talk a little bit about what the site investigators have to say about their own challenges and a little bit about what people say about the burden of participating in trials. Then we're going to hear from our other special guests. We have 4 representatives from different companies who are involved in clinical operations of those companies. From Therapeutics, we have Angela Britton, who's the Clinical Research Associate. From Prosensa is Susie Dorricott, Head of Clinical Project Management. From Therapeutics, we have Alan Reha, who's Senior Director of Clinical Development and Project Management. And from Sarepta Therapeutics, Kate Haviland, who's Head of Commercial Development. So the way we'll set things up, I'm going to give you a little bit of introductory information. Then Holly's going to present a couple of slides from what we've learned from our survey. And then we'll go into a panel discussion with our 4 industry guests. So we imagine that my presentation and Holly's will probably go no more than 20 minutes. We'll hear from industry for about 20 minutes, and then we will have the chance for all of you to weigh in, and we might ask some specific questions to the audience. You can participate in the call by typing your message into the chat box. All of us who are presenting information, our industry guests, will be able to see those messages as they come up. So if you type your questions in, we're going to hold questions probably till the last third of the call. But at that point, we'll ask you to please give us some feedback. So that's how we're going to start things out. Just to start, I'd like to make the point that, 10 years ago, there were only a handful of trials underway for Duchenne. Most of these were either testing supplements or drugs that were already approved. But you could really count on one hand the number of trials that were going on simultaneously, and these were often small. They were all academic studies, and that changed dramatically over the last several years, starting with PTC's Therapeutics Haviland trial, which was the first trial of a new drug for Duchenne, and it really sort of paved the way. And that was in 2004, 2005. Now we have 49 open clinical protocols for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. 24 of those are actually treatment interventions, and of those, we have 2 phase 3 studies that are coming to completion, 2 that are just starting, and a third that's planned for 2014. So there's been a significant change in the landscape for Duchenne. It means that a lot more people have participated in trials, and a lot more people understand what they're about. And I think a lot of us are paying more attention to what it's like and having to make tough decisions. Do we want our child to go into this trial or that trial? So we're going to take a little look now at what it's like on the other end to actually set up and run one of these trials, and also get your input. It helps that we have a lot of different targets, as you see. That's probably spurring the large number of trials. Many of these targets are in different cellular pathways, which means there's the potential that we could have combination treatments ultimately that would have a sort of synergistic or additive effect, so greater than you would have given either one alone. It's speculative at this point, but it's certainly something that everyone is very interested in. Looking at this another way, you can see this is not a comprehensive slide, but a lot of the trials that are going on, especially in the U.S., are listed here. And you can see that we have quite a few in later stages, phase 2 and phase 3. Just to give you some idea, I'm sure everybody at this point is pretty familiar with what these different phases look like. Phase 1 is generally safety testing and sort of understanding how the drug is metabolized by the body. Phase 2 is often safety and some efficacy and understanding more about dose. And then phase 3 is usually what we call the registration study, where the results are actually used to support a new drug application. A registration trial is usually a phase 3, but we have certainly seen a couple of examples recently where people have taken phase 2 data to see if that phase 2 could be a registration trial. And that does happen, but it's not very common. What you don't see here that you hear about that gets confusing are the phase 1/2 studies, the phase 2A, phase 2B, phase 2/3. So all of those variations can happen, and there's usually some sort of hybrid trial between the phases. And also, just to give you a little rundown, so all of our guests from industry could probably fill this slide out in much, much greater detail. But just to give you some idea what it's like to actually develop and run one of these trials, these are some of the basic steps to setting up a trial. Again, there are pages and pages and pages of detail that could fill these out. But, in general, the sponsor has to understand, do a feasibility study, understand where the patients are, who is likely to qualify for the trial based on the eligibility criteria. At the same time, they're working on protocol development. That's usually, the protocol includes the endpoints that will be measured and how they will be measured. And these are developed with input from clinical investigators, evaluators, regulators, and hopefully families as well get to weigh in on those. All of this gets wrapped together with the preclinical data into a submission to the FDA for an investigational new drug application, and this is often a very hefty set of papers and a lot of work. They have to identify sites. They have to understand which sites are capable of starting the trials and have experienced investigators and would be able to recruit the right number of patients and, have a good track record in this department. When they get to site startup, I think that's where things get really, really fun. They have to negotiate contracts with each and every site. If it's a multi-site trial, they have to get institutional review board approval for the protocol at each and every site. And if there are any changes to that protocol, it all has to go back through these IRBs at each and every site. And each IRB has a different timeline and a different process for approval. They have to train the evaluators. They also have to train the investigators for every trial. Even if the investigator has just been trained by another sponsor, they have to go through good clinical practice training again for the next trial. They have to orchestrate recruitment, which means, helping the sites advertise sometimes and coordinate that. And then when the study is actually underway, they also have quite a lot of checks and balances and reporting requirements. Adverse event reporting. They go through site audits to make sure they're doing everything right. They look at their quality assurance. They do travel coordination and reimbursement of participants and data transfer. At this stage, a lot of this work may be handled by a contract research organization, which is sort of a third party that can do some of this. And then the study wind-up is data analysis. They might have continued access programs that have to be organized. So I think that actually developing and running a clinical trial is much like launching the space shuttle. It's very, very complex. And you do the best job you can at putting it all together, and then at some point you have to pull the trigger and say, okay, this is the best, the best of our knowledge, this is our best protocol, these are our best sites. We're going to go ahead and launch. And at that point, you have to move forward. So I just wanted people to have some perspective, and you'll hear some more about these things from our industry guests and where the real challenges are, because I think that it's easy to say, well, you should have done this differently or that differently, and maybe that's true. It's a bit of a learning process as well, because there are no approved drugs for Duchenne currently, but just to give you some idea what goes into it. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Holly, who's going to tell you what we learned from our survey that we did earlier. So let's move to Holly's slides. And Holly, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes doing a very high-level overview of some of the themes we found in the first phase of PPMD's NINDS-funded study on clinical trial expectations and experiences. You're going to hear a lot from industry today, so I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about thoughts from other stakeholders, including parents and clinicians, and then, of course, people on the line will have a chance to weigh in as well. Okay, go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about parents' perception of trial burden, I will reinforce that this varies by trial. So we did have 6 trials represented in our parent reports, and it varied quite a bit. Most parents did perceive that the time required was burdensome, but they were prepared for this burden. Most of the parents did not have any regret over making the decision to participate for their child and felt that it was worth it, but about half did feel like that there was significant trial burden. The specific ways that parents felt the trial was burdensome was primarily insufficient communication, so feeling like they were not always aware, and that came in lots of different flavors, and I'm sure we can discuss that a bit more further when we have our group discussion. People who were in placebo-controlled trials felt that the placebo randomization was a burden, but again, one that they were prepared for. Parents did not feel prepared for the financial burden that some of the clinical trials placed on them, and that was a problem for many of the families. Families perceived rigid protocols were sometimes burdensome, interactions with CROs, and sometimes not meeting parents' expectations, that expectations of the study that were not met, and that was perceived to be a burden. In terms of burden to the child, actual participant, most of the parents perceived that the time burden was manageable, and actually all of the parents felt that other than clinical trials where there was a biopsy, that there was actually minimal burden for the child who participated. In fact, it was a positive experience for their children. I'm going to shift gears and tell a little bit about what we heard from clinicians. We interviewed clinicians involved in clinical trial sites. We interviewed clinicians from 10 different clinical trials and 11 clinicians, and they had a range of responsibilities in the clinical trials. Many of them were PIs. Some of them were study coordinators or physical therapists. One of the overarching themes we heard from the clinicians was that they, of course, are managing a dual relationship as part of the clinical trial where they're wearing a hat of a clinician as well as an investigator. And in that relationship, they all strongly perceive that their clinician role won out. And they felt that they were responsible for protecting the families in the trials from unacceptable burden or burden that could be modified, as well as being emotionally upset by the trial. Now, I will say now that I'm about to show slides about what the clinicians asked to be done differently. They had many nice things to say as well, but I'm going to talk about what their recommendations were. So I will just try to reinforce when possible that they had many very positive things to say about their experiences as well. So one thing that one of the clinicians said, and this is related again to their perceiving their role is primarily as serving the patients and the families. One clinician said, I think the interest clinicians are most concerned about is the parent and the child. And my attitude is that as long as they're comfortable, then I will participate and be enthusiastic about the participation. I guess I'm saying I really don't care about industry. I care about the fact that you might potentially help your child, and this is what it takes. So talking again about industry being an important tool to get the child access to a potential therapeutic that might end up having benefit to the child or to the community in the long term. So recommendations that the clinicians came up with, the majority of those recommendations were focused around communication, so having more and more open communication with the sponsor. I will again reinforce that this varies depending on the sponsor and the trial. We did have a number of different trials reviewed in this, and some of those were small trials, and some of them were very large multi-site trials, and the perception of communication was quite different. But overall, there was a wish for greater meaningful input on the design of the trial, so getting the clinicians involved very early on in discussions about how to make the protocol better so that it's less burdensome to families, has maybe different procedures. The clinicians felt like that they had a lot of input that would be helpful there. However, there was a concern that sometimes when clinicians are very involved in creating the design of the trial that they become very invested, and some of them talked about that actually being a challenge, that they were so professionally invested that they didn't have maybe the kind of professional distance that they would have preferred at some points in the trial. They also talked about the challenge of working with the CRO. So this is a shared theme in the parents and the clinicians that there were challenges when they had an intermediary between themselves and the sponsor. And several of the clinicians actually used the term hired help. They felt like they were just serving a purpose and did not have any input and were unable to act in the way that they hoped to protect the interests of their families. So let's go. Okay, there we go. A couple other things that clinicians recommended for the communication. So again, this theme of they felt an obligation, a professional obligation to challenge the sponsor when there are logistics that didn't make sense or were too burdensome, or any other time they felt like there was burden. And one example that one of the clinicians gave is a procedure that was set to occur on Christmas Eve, and that had happened 2 years in a row, and they were quite upset about that and felt like they needed to do something about that, and felt that that was one of their professional roles. There was a concern that several raised that the sponsors don't understand Duchenne or Becker muscular dystrophy, and that they would, again, encourage the sponsors to reach out to experts so that they can create the best possible design. And also several talked about a communication breakdown that happened when something unexpected occurs, where the clinicians perceived that they did not receive sufficient information, and also perceived that the families were not receiving sufficient or accurate information about what was happening. And a quote from one of the clinicians who said, "I would say that with some sponsors it's been very open and encouraged, and they're eager to hear comments. And I think there have been other instances where it's more like lip service, or where they sort of politely ask for your opinion and then ignore it or don't even ask at all." So again, this reflects the variability in how clinicians perceive the communication that they're having with the sponsors. Sorry, I had a lag with my advance. So the one other thing I'm going to briefly describe is that we asked the clinicians, if you could change anything about the clinical trial process, what would you change? And the majority of them talked about changing the informed consent process, so having more time to discuss the potential to participate in the trial with families, being able to do that at multiple visits over a long period of time, being able to have reduced complexity, so simpler information that they could pass along to families, and as well requested that they could change the approach, and that would be something that would have to go through sponsors and IRBs, but could we move toward a different approach to the informed consent, where, for example, we have stories, parents who've been involved with clinical trials before share their experiences, so these little vignettes, or using multimedia, showing videos of the procedures that would happen to the children, having parents or decision makers take quizzes to make sure they're understanding the information. So there were lots of interesting suggestions on the actual informed consent process. Clinicians also talked about desiring a community education and information source, so some sort of trusted third party that could be an information source for everyone, where clinicians and families and sponsors could sort of meet and share information, and that this would be a resource that would be valuable to people in clinical trials, but also would be a learning tool for people considering clinical trials, so that they would benefit from the collective wisdom of parents who've been through the experience. And then again, the last one is one you've heard about before, which is more clinician input on the trial design. So those are the major things that clinicians wish they could change of the process. So that was a very quick overview of, again, my slide's not changing. There we go. So it's a very quick overview of some of the themes we've heard from clinicians and from families about burden and about the clinical trial experience. We are doing, in Phase 2, surveys, and we would really like webinar participants to participate in this survey. So if you're interested or willing, please email me. My email is on the screen. It's holly@parentprojectmd.org. I'd love to tell you more about those surveys and have parents participate. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Sharon. Yes?
Yeah. Before we go, to participate in the study, do people have to have been part of a clinical trial?
No. People can either just want to share information about their thoughts about clinical trials, or you can have been in a clinical trial, and we're also looking for people who've been in a natural history study. So really, almost anyone can participate. So if you're interested in hearing more, please let me know.
Okay, thanks, Holly. That was great. I'm going to back the slides up and kind of leave up, I think, this slide about the clinical trial. Let's see if I can try that again. Slide 6. I'm going to leave this slide up, and we're going to move to the discussion portion of our webinar now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our industry participants to introduce themselves and say a few words about their experience with clinical trials, and maybe think about what you would like people to know about what it's like to develop and run a clinical trial from your perspective. And then we'll go to some specific questions after we've heard from everyone briefly. So if we could start with Angela Britton, who's a clinical research associate at Halo Therapeutics. As many of you know, Halo has an ongoing phase 1/2 trial that's underway now. So Angela, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. I manage the clinical operations team for our ongoing trials, and so I'm involved in all the aspects of the clinical trial setup and conduct. And I've worked in the Duchenne community with clinical trial operations for the last 10 years. And I know that a lot of, the feedback from the families and from the clinicians and from the community, it's extremely useful, and you hear a lot of the same things repeatedly. But I think it's really exciting that the discussions are progressing within the community, because it's really important for us to be able to find a way to balance, to balance what we need to do scientifically with the clinical trial design and conduct, along with the burden that the families are experiencing. And it is something that I think everybody does try and do, and sometimes we might hit it on the head, and sometimes we kind of hit the nail on the side. And so there are a lot of challenges to it, but I think there are a lot of ways that improvements can be made, and hopefully those are some of the discussions that we can have today.
Thank you, Angela. I'll go to Susie Dorricott, who's head of clinical project management at Prosensa, and as we all know, Prosensa has a number of trials that are underway now. So, Susie, do you want to give us your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've worked at Prosensa for the last 4 years. My background before that, I've been in the industry for about 12 years, working in various clinical trials. But when I came to Prosensa, I hadn't worked at all in rare disease or obviously Duchenne. So for me, it's been a massive learning experience over the last 4 years. I think the major issue we have is the protocols and the protocol design, trying to make sure we have endpoints where we can kind of try and capture what's happening to the boys. And certainly even 4 years ago, because we didn't have much that much of an understanding of how to actually measure change, we put a lot of things in the protocols. So the protocols have become quite burdensome. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today, and hopefully we can dig a bit deeper into those sort of aspects as well.
Okay, thank you. And so now we'll go to Alan Reha, Senior Director of Clinical Development and Project Management at PTC Therapeutics. We mentioned before, PTC Therapeutics really paved the way with the first new drug trial in Duchenne, and they are preparing now for a phase 3. Alan?
Yes, thank you. So, certainly been involved in Duchenne research, particularly in clinical studies, for a number of years. I've been at PTC for about 7 years, leading the trials of our lead compound, Adalorin, in patients with nonsense mutation, DMD. And this is quite a unique experience. Previously, I was involved in rare disorders, but this is the first time involved in Duchenne. So, admittedly, it was definitely a steep learning curve, but certainly had the opportunity to be involved in our early proof of concept study, our phase 2B registration-directed study, as you mentioned, the first registration-directed study in DMD, and now we're actively conducting our phase 3 confirmatory study in DMD. I think, from my perspective, we see it as kind of building the runway as you're landing, so to speak. So, there's a lot of lessons learned here at PTC that we have in the context of our trials, particularly about endpoints, in the context of natural history, how to have more focused, refined clinical trials. And I think a big element of that is, companies learning various information about trials and patients and having different experiences, but then taking that learning and sharing that with the community, community being other academics involved in the study, other industry individuals involved in the study, et cetera. So collectively, we're all going to make mistakes and not get it perfectly right, each company being, the first in clinical trials, but I think each step of the way, our knowledge, we get smarter, and to kind of pass that knowledge to each company, so research becomes that much better and more focused to ultimately find, treatments for Duchenne. So I look forward to participating in this call.
Thank you, Ellen. So we'll go to Kate Haviland, who's head of commercial development at Sarepta Therapeutics.
Thanks, Sharon. Thank you, Sharon, and thanks to PPMD for inviting Sarepta to participate in this important webinar. I think here at Sarepta, we are working on a therapeutic that addresses the underlying cause of the disease, and I think that poses some unique challenges. I have been working with the Duchenne community since 2005, and have been working in the rare disease space for over 10 years now. And, building on what Alan said, I think in my role, I'm partnering very closely with the clinical group here at Sarepta, and I think a forum such as this, where we spend a lot of our time getting feedback from key opinion leaders and physicians in the field, but be able to get more direct patient feedback about their experience in clinical studies is very important to us, especially as we are gearing up to start our large Phase 2B confirmatory or Phase 3 study in the beginning of next year.
Okay, great. So I think I'll start with a question that I will throw out to any of you to answer, and that is thinking about the startup of a study. Can you discuss a little bit about the challenges that you've run into with starting up a study? And again, we're not talking necessarily about the very specifics of a particular drug or a site or names of investigators, but in general, where have you encountered the most difficulty? And I think the goal here is to think about ways that maybe families or patient organizations or other people can help solve some of those problems. So if anyone wanted to weigh in on where those challenges are.
I think it's Susie, Dorricott here. I think one of the major challenges we faced as a group is the contracts. That really causes us a lot of difficulty with the sites and having to negotiate with their lawyers to try and get the contracts sorted out. It can be very time consuming. They can come back with comments, and then we have to go through the round of lawyer review again. And it's something that we have to do for each individual. So for us as a clinical group, that's been a very time consuming activity. And it really did slow us down. We were looking at our metrics this time round, and it really added a great deal of time to the process.
Mm-hmm.
This is Alan from PTC. I agree with that comment, and certainly, I'm conducting trials around the world in various countries. The U.S. is specifically challenging with respect to site startup timelines, where it's actually a broad range we've experienced. From sites could be very quick up and running in a matter of 2 months approximately, to anywhere between 6 to 9 months or even more, where, as was mentioned, one of the rate limiting steps could certainly be negotiation of site contracts and budgets. So I think really there's a big need to develop efficiencies there to reduce the overall startup time, particularly with contract and budget negotiations. So the sooner we can get the drug to the clinic to investigate in the trial and get the data from the clinical study.
So Sharon, this is Kate, and I just want to add in that I think one of the other areas that could be really useful that patient advocacy and patients could engage in is identification of clinical trial sites. You presented in some of the original slides you had at the beginning of the webinar that this is almost a good problem to have. We're now at a point where we have 49 studies being run in Duchenne, and 24 of which are interventional and probably have some fairly complex protocols that's been mentioned by some of the other presenters. And I think some of the things we are seeing now is that many of the clinical sites are now running multiple studies, and there's potentially some capacity issues with research staff. So helping to identify additional sites and additional investigators and getting those folks trained and getting them the right staff at their sites as well to help really expand the capacity of the clinical trial infrastructure, I think is something that would be really useful to us as a sponsor.
Mm-hmm. Right. This is Angela with DART and HALO as well, and I think one of the challenges talking about the timelines of the contract and budget negotiation is that there's not a single problem that can be pinpointed that would reduce the timeline there. What, from my experience, we run into a lot is it's very site-specific, and even within that site, depending on what's going on in that institution or the time of year or, staffing changes that they have, that those have huge impacts. And so it's been extremely challenging to find ways to streamline those processes to cut down the startup timeline in regards to that.
Yep.
Right. I know, the idea of a master site contract comes up periodically. And so for people on the phone, this would be a sort of template contract that in theory all the sites would agree to, and it would cut down on the total negotiation. And yet it has been very difficult to implement something like that, even in pretty tight-knit networks. Does anyone have any comment about that?
Yeah, this is Alan from PTC. Yeah, I would have. That sounds very interesting. I think, as a first step would certainly be as a company performing multiple studies in Duchenne, even going to a site for a second time, being able for them to recognize what we've previously negotiated in terms of legal text conditions and budget parameters around a given outcome measure, to start from there rather than, so to speak, start from scratch and renegotiating the entire contract and budget again. And we found that does happen on occasion where you would think there would be efficiencies gained being at a site for a second or third time, but oftentimes because of different personnel being involved from the administrative side at the site, we have to start from kind of ground zero in negotiating contracts and sites. So certainly kind of building on what was previously negotiated would certainly be a great start to the road of a master service agreement across a large number of sites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's Susie here. We've had quite a bit of experience of that recently, where we've had two compounds, so Pro 45 and 53, starting up within a very short time frame at the same institution. And unfortunately, even though we've negotiated, in some cases only a matter of months beforehand, the institutions were still reluctant to look at what we'd negotiated before. So it really is something that, if we can again, as a community of sponsors, encourage institutions to try and look at things and try and streamline the way we're doing things. And, I don't know whether they would be able to set prices for a certain period of time so you don't have to renegotiate all the time with them. That would be a really, really great thing and really would save months. Like we know, for example, in our natural history study in Argentina, we've been waiting a year and we still don't have approval. And that's because we haven't got the clinical trial agreement, so the CTA has not been agreed, and it's taken a year. And that sort of time frame is just very, very difficult to deal with.
Right, and I understand one of the complications too is the university contracting offices often aren't just specifically doing clinical trial site contracts. They're doing all contracts for the university, and it might be example came up in an earlier discussion of a building project that was going on that sort of took all of their time and attention away. So I think there are, some issues like that come into play at the university level as well.
And this is Angela. I think another interesting aspect is at a lot of these institutions, the investigators are, extremely interested and active in trying to push things along, and that doesn't have the impact that you would hope that it would have working with the contracts office. And so even when you have, some advocates trying to help make that an efficient timeline, we find that we're still just kind of beating our heads against the wall there.
So what do you think overall is the impact of this problem with negotiating site contracts? If you could, again, wave a wand and maybe each site contract 2 weeks, what would be the impact on your, ability to get trials done efficiently and the cost of the trials? Do you have any thoughts about what that would do?
Yeah, this is Alan. I think, you would still have to encounter other required steps. For example, each site has a required IRB review. Usually, in Duchenne, we've experienced these are local academic, IRBs, so there is no central IRB involved. So you would still have to be placed within the IRB parameter and other scientific reviews that some sites require on top of IRB review. But certainly, a number of sites, particularly in the U.S., we found that the site contract and budget finalization is a rate-limiting step. So certainly, speeding that up would ultimately result in that site being activated and thereby being able to bring in patients quicker and then, further downstream effects. But just on the subject of multiple site administration, kind of putting your contract in the pile, so to speak, above all the other clinical trial projects for various other disorder areas. We've found that, at least in some country levels, there's this element of fast-tracking trials that are focused on rare disorders, and I wonder if such a fast-track approach could be implemented somehow at sites where, we're studying, a rare disorder here, and there's, working with a sense of urgency, much more so than other investigative areas, and would it be possible to kind of fast-track these rare disorder clinical investigations to get them through the contracting negotiation process quicker than the other protocols?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. And there are, groups of university-wide groups that are focused on research, so, maybe could be approached about some of these things. So that's something that could be brought up. You mentioned IRBs at one point and the difficulty with getting multiple IRB approvals. What about the idea of a central IRB? So again, for people on the phone, would be an IRB that would be one central site rather than using all the individual institution sites. The institutions have to agree to defer their right to look at the ethics of the protocol to a central IRB. And when that happens, it can save time. But it doesn't happen very often. So maybe people could talk about why that is, that we still have this multiple IRB system.
This is Angela from DART. I think in the past when we've talked with various participating sites, staff and even had some communications with their IRBs, they've had some reluctancy to go that route, and some IRBs had even indicated that even with a central IRB use, they would also like to have a level of approval involved, which is, I think, extremely interesting. And so I think there's some reluctancy, or maybe because it's not widely prevalent, people are just more uncomfortable with some of the unknown. And if there, with more information shared, or if there was a wider buy-in from kind of a larger set of the sites, that would be something that was more amenable and more achievable.
Okay, so I think it's something that would be useful that we all agree is not going to be easy to accomplish, although hopefully things are moving that direction. Maybe we could move into a slightly different area and talk a little bit about recruitment for trials. I think Kate hinted at the fact that we have enough ongoing trials now that we might have a situation where we have competition for recruitment from one trial to the next, and competition will actually hurt all trials across the board. So what sort of experiences have you had with recruitment, and do you have any thoughts about how to improve that?
Sharon, this is Kate from Sarepta. I think that the clinical infrastructure and some of the constraints that we may be seeing with the increase in the number of trials, which is a really good problem to have for the community, I think that's one element of patient recruitment. I think some of the other dimensions of that can cause some trouble is that for someone like the technology that we're working on or the PTC is working on, where you have genetically targeted subsets of a patient population that you're looking to enroll, and then you layer upon that additional criteria, eligibility criteria, to help minimize variability. So with functional types of criteria, or we have endpoints that are specific to a patient population that is ambulatory, for instance, as we're using the 6-minute walk test as the clinical efficacy endpoint. We end up really getting to a very small number of patients who are potentially eligible for a study. And I think there are a few things that can be done here, and that is, the development of new endpoints that are able to accommodate a broader range of patients in studies, so patients with different functional abilities, whether that be the very young patients or patients who are non-ambulant, or to look for other types of markers of efficacy, such as biomarkers that can really cut across any kind of patient genotype and or functional status that will allow a broader array of patients to be tested in clinical studies.
Mm-hmm. Hi, this is Alan from PTC. It's certainly a challenge, starting Duchenne work in 2005, 2006. Certainly observed the additional trials and companies being involved, which is great. The more research, the better. But I would like to recognize the work that TreatMD has been doing and working with each country to really refine their patient registries. So I think one answer could be really identification of patients, greater participation at the national level within patient registries. So, a trial such as PTCs or Sareptas or others that's targeting a defined patient population in that registry, collecting key outcome measure data, we can get a good sense in terms of where the patients are and do they have that requisite genetic mutation that the drug is reliant upon. As well as at the site level, they have a TreatMD, a care and trial site registry, which I believe is over 250 sites worldwide that they've subscribed, input information about their sites and adherence to standard of care, which is also very important, how many patients they see, outcome measures, experience, and training. All this information, the more sites participating, the better, but all this information being inputted could provide real value to companies, looking for patients and trial sites in Duchenne.
Mm-hmm. And for the record, the PPMD Duchenne Connect registry transmits collects core data elements that are part of feed into the TreatMD global registry as well. So we have been benefited from TreatMD's leadership there.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much.
And this is Angela. I think another aspect to consider when we talk about patient identification is, these multiple trials that are running, quote unquote, concurrently. The timelines with startup that we talked about earlier, I think it can be really challenging both for sites and for families because you have an idea of when you're going to start, and a delay of 3 months or 6 months in getting approvals can change whether makes a difference in whether someone's eligible. Families are often, more interested in one study than another, and so they skip involvement in one study, only to find out, by the time approval's obtained and they can go through full screening, that they're not eligible, for some reason. And so, I think the discussion of timelines and how to streamline those so all sites are up within the relatively same time will also be a benefit to patient identification.
Right. I know certainly families are trying to plan around school issues that some have moved and family things, because when you have those visits scheduled, you really have to keep to the protocol schedule, and so it can be quite a burden. And if you can't plan that in any sort of reasonable way, it's really difficult, I think, for families as well. So that's a really good point. If we could move just quickly before we move to the open discussion and talk a little bit about after the sites are signed up and they're up and running and they're starting to enroll patients and the study is underway, what challenges do you see at that point? Or are you then in the home stretch?
No, I think certainly once the site is activated, this is Alan from PTC, the topic of recruitment, that is the key, finding the patients and having sites bring those patients in as quickly as possible, and then thereby, those patients and their parents participating in the study, ensuring compliance to the related study outcome measures, because ultimately the good compliance leads to quality data, so we want to have as complete data as possible for analysis and decision making. So, I think sites have done a great job in terms of from their training and work with parents and form a great relationship to ensure compliance, but that's certainly one of the challenges associated with the execution phase of a trial.
Mm-hmm. And this is Kate from Sarepta. Just to add to what Alan said, I think once you're underway in the study, I think something that has been highlighted as being very important is to continue to help train sites and make sure that the functional assessments that are so critical to us in our database are done uniformly, and that across centers that data is something that can be compared, and that we really ensure that all of the evaluations that are done in these multi-center global studies are done in as much of a uniform way as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's important as well. Around training, we've been discussing that recently in terms of how to make sure the 6-minute walk in particular is performed across global sites in the same way. And we've been using some videotaping as part of that to record what happens, and it's very interesting. We saw some issues come up there with and it wasn't spotted when the boys were performing the 6-minute walk. It was only seen afterwards when we viewed the videos. The boy was kind of leaning and pushing himself along with the wall next to it. So I think, there's things like that we need to be very vigilant for, to keep an eye on, and the training aspect and making sure, not doing cascade training. So that means that the individual master trainer should really train each site rather than train someone at site who then cascades that training onto someone else. We found that's very important also, although it means higher cost, it ensures that we keep that training level high.
And this is Angela from DART, and I echo what everybody else is saying. I also think there's an opportunity for us to with the sites and ultimately to be relayed to the patients that are ultimately enrolled. More of an explanation or an understanding of why the timing of a lot of the visits and assessments is so important. I think it is an extreme commitment time-wise when you enroll into a study, and even when you know what all of the timing of the visits are, real life happens, but there is a reason that we set up the different timing of the visits the way we did, and that can often have an impact on the data if we're 2 weeks off or 4 weeks off with getting some of those data points. And so I think there's just a little muddy understanding of that, and hopefully that's something that we can, kind of change moving forward as well.
Okay. So I want people who are listening in on the phone to have a chance to ask some questions, and I'd sort of challenge you to think about what this is your chance to get questions answered. What about the clinical trial process just doesn't make sense to you? If there's something you've always wondered, why do you have to do X or why do you have to do Y, or why is this a problem? It's something that you could write in here. You can write in questions in the chat box. We will all see them, and we'll answer them. I have a few that were sent to me in advance that we can talk about. But while you're thinking about that, to give people a chance to think about those questions or comments, maybe you want to share your experience. Maybe you have a 6-minute walk test experience that you would like to share, because I've certainly heard some interesting stories about that. I think I would like to ask all of our industry guests to see if you have any response to the information that Holly presented, where she talked about the feedback from site investigators, where it sounded like, some of their key issues was wanting more input into protocol development and better communication. So I'd be curious to just see how you respond to that.
Yeah, I think this is Alan from PTC. Certainly, we recognize the need to involve investigators and experts, key opinion leaders, into trial design, and and I'm sure other companies as well, often put together study steering committees of experts around the world on endpoints, care of Duchenne, et cetera, and allow them, as well as representatives from patient advocacy groups such as PPMD, to be involved and have a stake in the protocol design, because ultimately, everyone is involved. We're all stakeholders in the process. So that's really a key element there. But also, certainly agree on communication to keep everyone abreast of where things are with the trial on a regular basis. For example, during the trial, if all goes well, recruitment is going well, giving everyone enough awareness on how the trial is relative to closing recruitment. Where the study is soon to reach its required sample size, which is great news in terms of to ultimately get an answer a little bit sooner, but to ultimately communicate to clinicians, investigators, who then thereby communicate to the patients on the status of trials, I think is very helpful.
And
I go on. Sorry, Susie here. I was just going to say, that's exactly our approach as well, is, the twofold approach is trying to make sure the investigators are up to speed with what's going on in the trial. And then obviously with the patient organisations trying to give updates. And again, I think that's something that's been very good that's come around more recently, I would say, in the last couple of years, is the sponsors updating patient organisations with how things are going. And I think that's an excellent way of making sure the information gets to the families, either through the investigator or through the patient organisations. And I agree. I think communication is really important. And in the rare disease field, we obviously want to engage with the patient community, and I think that is improving.
Just to add, this is Kate from Sarepta. I think some of Holly's findings were really interesting, and as both Alan and Susie said, there's a lot of mechanisms through which we can engage the KOL community and the investigators to get their feedback. But I think these trial designs are really difficult for everyone in taking into account patients and family needs and burdens, as well as the burden on the clinical site in the context of these investigators running studies, maybe multiple studies, and continuing their clinical care schedules. And then I think the other dimension we haven't really talked about yet is that, as industry, we're really on the front lines with the regulators who have another voice in the design of a study and the design elements of a protocol, and that's something that balancing kind of all three of those feedback and input is something that we as sponsors, it's challenging, and it's something that we take on the ownership to do.
Okay, we have some questions coming in. One question here about IRBs, and the question is, how many studies? It's in addition to IRBs. How many studies incorporate independent panels of experts to score each soft functional assessment, for instance, 6-minute walk test video, as valid to give the results more power in the eye of regulatory bodies? So I think at first, just to clarify, the IRB is actually just involved in looking at the ethical aspects of the study. They're not involved in the evaluation per se, but it sounds like the question is are there independent panels, maybe people who aren't paid by or related to the company who score, these 6-minute walk test videos? Maybe you could address a lot of aspects of that question, and maybe the scoring, for example, they're not actually kind of scored. But
this is Alan from PTC. I think the elements of having a 6-minute walk result declared as valid is key, and in terms of analysis perspective, analyzing only valid results is a key component of, companies' assessment of 6-minute walk overall results. As was mentioned earlier, there's been this new, leveraging of technology through videotaping, et cetera, that allows us, we at PTC were doing it, and I believe that was started through Prosensa's work of allowing independent experts to review the videos and actually confirm the site designation of whether or not our test is valid. Just having an independent quality control check of the measure through video capture, I think it's a really neat use of technology, and it ensures that we're all continuing oversight of the outcome measures and the resulting data.
And Sharon, this is Angela from DART. Something that maybe some people aren't quite as familiar with is the amount of training that the testers receive, or the physical therapists that, walk the children through the different procedures and assessments. And I think just to kind of, set a baseline for the ongoing study that we have and the different assessments that the physical therapists conduct, they did about 20 hours of training to show that they were going to be consistent and they understood the measure and the documentation and what was valid and not valid. So there's a lot of time and effort up front that goes into trying to make that consistent and reliable.
Okay. I'm going to move to another question. We have a question about testing in exon skipping trials specifically, and whether there could be a process of getting cell cultures to see if an oligonucleotide can correct gene expression for those cells and then treat the patients for whom it works rather than testing every oligo separately. So it's not about the clinical trial process specifically, but a little bit about maybe getting from point A to point B faster.
Sharon, this is Kate from Sarepta. So I think, I think that's a very good question. I think one of the challenges we have in exon skipping specifically that maybe other therapeutic approaches don't have is how do we develop the technology for rare genotypes where there may not be maybe too few patients to really power a more traditional clinical study on an endpoint such as the 6-minute walk test. And I think that's where the establishment of a biomarker as a surrogate endpoint, something such as dystrophin, which we know is, the lack of dystrophin is a direct cause of the disease, and therefore, replacing that dystrophin should lead to meaningful clinical benefit for the patients. I think the approach that Sarepta has talked pretty broadly about is this approach to class approval, which is trying to establish an endpoint such as dystrophin to in a larger patient population, such as the exon 51 skippable group, and then be able to do exactly kind of what the person asking the question has indicated, which is once we've been able to establish that replacing dystrophin to meaningful levels is what causes a clinical benefit on a measure such as a 6-minute walk test, that we'd be able to go into those smaller, more rare genotypes and show maybe, in vitro or in vivo that dystrophin is replaced and therefore not go into be able to have patients access that therapy based on just that evidence. And I think that is something that we're working hard here to understand better, and also, in discussions with the patient groups and the regulators and the physician community.
Yeah, this is Alan from PTC. Yeah, that's certainly important, and links back to the need to really get feedback from the regulators, for example, the EMA and FDA, on outcome measures, and what is their position on biomarkers and whether or not there's relevant biomarkers out there, because as there is certain level of burden associated with that, but certainly there's definitely a need to develop biomarkers in Duchenne.
Yeah, exactly the same for us at the moment in Prosensa, just trying to figure out what the right way forward is and trying to make these protocols less burdensome, but also not cutting out endpoints or tests that might actually add value to your data. So we're trying to assimilate the data that we do have to see where we think we've seen any changes. And certainly one biomarker for us in particular is imaging, that we obviously see the data coming out of the imaging DMD project in the US, the natural history that looks, an encouraging way forward, and something we're looking at in our studies as well. So I think it's a case of trying to identify what outcome measures we think will add the most value, and then implementing them across the studies, across the sponsors, so then we all know what we need to target for to see whether our drugs are having an effect or not.
Okay, and here's a tough one that I think is about access to drugs for people who don't necessarily qualify to be in the trial. My son is 21 years old, and he has been in a wheelchair since 10 years old. He does not qualify for the trials. Why are other illnesses like cancer allowed to have these drugs available to people who do not qualify because of the last stages of an illness? Anyone? I'm going to tackle that very good question. The implication being that he's, that his son is not being offered drugs through any kind of program, and he doesn't qualify for trials. And I think a lot of parents are in that situation, and families and young men. We can say we need other endpoints, but I guess the question is, what are the challenges? Let me put it that way. What are the challenges to providing access to maybe young men who don't qualify for trials? Because it's never as easy as just giving the drug. I understand that.
Yeah, it is, and I think a number of companies have struggled with this, and I think it's particularly challenging in a rare disorder where there isn't a lot of patients out there, and for a company that's doing clinical trials, it could be a slippery slope in terms of ultimately providing drug, and that would be in direct competition with trying to complete various clinical trials. So it is a very, very challenging topic.
I also think that there was some very interesting discussion around this, Sharon, at the meeting that you hosted with the FDA recently. Some discussion of potentially opening up some of the trials to some of these patients that fall outside of maybe the age or the ambulation status or what's currently tagged as the eligibility criteria, and to note up front that potentially they wouldn't be included in the efficacy data review, but you would be able to they would be able to take the drug and you could collect safety data there. So I think that there's discussions ongoing surrounding that because it's something that's on the minds of everyone, I think.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I want to fit in at least one more. We're right at the end of the hour, but maybe one more quick question from someone who wrote in, and that is, and I think there'll be a quick answer. Are participants in a trial allowed to share with the Duchenne community details of the trial? For example, what is happening with their child and how they are progressing? And that may vary depending on what the expectations are when someone signs up for a trial.
Yeah, I think this is Alan from PTC. Generally there are some challenges with that in terms of communication of how they're doing, particularly in blinded studies where communication across different there's some precedence of this of causing issue in other disease areas, but certainly there's some caution that could be made that should be exercised because certainly in the context of double-blind trials, communicating information about a given patient across a number of other patients or individuals could have implications on the blind. So I think as a company, really exercise and encourage caution in terms of not encouraging communication of trial experience outside of the normal communication channels that the patients and parents have in the context of the study doctor or study staff team.
So you're saying when people get together and compare notes, it might be possible that they'd be able to determine who is on drug versus placebo, and that would unblind the study.
That would vary based upon, of course, the drug and if it has a safety profile that is potentially unblinding, but that could be certainly a concern for various drugs.
Mm-hmm.
We encourage
we encourage in our consent forms. Actually, we ask families or request that families try not to share the information in an open forum. But obviously, as Alan said, with family with doctor, that their family doctor, that's fine. But we also try and discourage that for the same reasons that were just discussed.
Okay. So I think we're at the end here, and I think what we've learned a lot about where some of the challenges are in clinical trials. And I think for me, it's interesting to see that there are some very significant time sinks that don't really add value. So the amount of time it takes to sign contracts, for example. And these things, I think, are all targets for intervention. Easier said than done. I think a lot of people have tried. But I think we know where some of the inefficiencies come in. So, the question we get asked all the time is, why does it take so long? Why does it take so long? This is a progressive disease, and everybody knows the clock is ticking. So I think if we can together identify some of these points that are really challenging, we can come up with solutions together. And we really welcome participation. If you have ideas, if you've listened to this webinar, and you've thought about these things and you have ideas and want to send those in to us, I think that would be useful as well. We can compile those responses. If I didn't get to your question, I apologize because we're right at the end of our time here. I do want to say right at the end that, we're interested in these topics because we've committed $300,000 to supporting a Duchenne superhighway, which is really money that's set aside to address some of these issues in clinical trials and efficiencies with the idea that a rising tide floats all boats. If we can solve some of these issues, it's going to benefit all of the drug development, and we think a lot of these drugs might be useful used in combination. So we really want to see multiple drugs succeed in parallel. And so with that, I want to thank very much our participants. I appreciate you all being here and being so open and sharing with us, where the challenges are and what you're trying to do. And I think it's great also to see you all here together so people understand that, the companies may at some level be in competition, but I think you're all, appreciate the fact that you're in similar positions and have been very open about sharing with one another what the issues and challenges are. So thank you very much. Thank you all here who have participated. Like I said, if I didn't get you to your question, we will maybe try and get you an answer afterwards. And please feel free to send me any additional questions. I see my email is up there on the screen now. So thank you very much.